Today we're going to make a walnut side table. I found a really rough piece of walnut from a tree that had fallen down, and I decided to see if I could salvage it and make something cool out of it. Now this technique would work with pretty much any wood species. This slice of a log is too big to fit in my planer, and sanding it down would take way too long. So I placed it on a plywood and 2x4 platform and hot glued it down using some shims to level it. I then used a table saw to rip down some 1/4 inch thick pieces of masonite along with some 3/4 inch thick plywood. I then started screwing the pieces of plywood on either side of the log. All I'm trying to do here is build up some spacers, and they don't have to be pretty, but it does help if they're parallel to each other. Once I've built the plywood up to the point where it's almost even with the top of the log, I then switch and add 2 strips of masonite on either side. I now have parallel supports on either side of the log that are hovering just above the log's uneven surface. I placed 2 pieces of aluminum angle on top of them, drilled some holes through the aluminum, and then screwed some scrap pieces of plywood to the aluminum to make a sled that's just a little bit wider than my palm router. All I'm trying to do is just make a nice track that my palm router can slide back and forth across. Now I do want to be careful to make sure that the bit in the router won't bump into the aluminum. I used a 1/2 inch diameter router bit and just started sliding it back and forth, trimming out about 1/4 inch of wood with each pass. This log was pretty uneven, so the first pass went quickly because there wasn't that much wood to remove. So then I removed one of the layers of masonite on either side, which lowers the whole sled about 1/4 inch, and then did the second pass. One of my buddies was visiting and he wanted to give it a try, and we just kept doing pass after pass, and with each additional pass we saw that the log was getting flatter and flatter, and we were slowly erasing all those uneven parts. Once we got the first side nice and flat, I used a putty knife to scrape away the hot glue and then flip the log over. I once again added a little bit of hot glue to keep the piece of wood from slipping, but I didn't need to use shims this time since I had a flat surface. And so I just kept going, pass after pass, each time going down about another 1/4 inch, and I would just keep achieving these differences in depth by adjusting the strips of plywood and masonite on either side of the log. Now that this side was flat, I was ready to start sanding. I used an orbital sander, and I started with 80 grit pads and then worked my way up to 150 grit pads before finishing with 220 grit pads. I wanted the outside to still be a little bit rough looking, so I didn't sand it too aggressively. I just went over it once with 150 grit and then again with 220 grit. Most of the work for this project is just in salvaging this rough piece of wood. So for legs, all I'm going to do is screw on some ready-made steel hairpin legs. I used 1 inch long pan head screws to attach the legs to the underside of the table. Now, I was careful to put some rags down so I didn't scratch that surface that I had worked so hard to sand. I finished the table with 3 coats of wipe-on poly. I would let it dry in between the coats and then lightly sand it down with 400 grit sandpaper. Now I didn't want it to look too shiny, so I made sure to pick the satin finish for the wipe-on poly. For more information, click on the links in the description box below. Be sure to check out our Instagram to see what we're working on next, and be sure to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Thanks. Bye.